All right, this is your Week 7 review. So in Week 7, we have 3 discussion boards. The first discussion board regarded John Stuart Mill, a tough reading, and received the fewest posts. Those that posted. Some of you got, I think, some of the core, and other points you were missing. Here's essentially what John Stuart Mill is saying, and he's one of the most important and prominent utilitarian thinkers. John Stuart Mill is essentially saying, look, you have an objection to utilitarianism. Some people say utilitarianism leads to people living like animals. Because if utilitarianism says that, well, it does say that the right action is that which increases pleasure and decreases pain, well, then what gives people pleasure? Sensual things, immediate, satisfying their immediate desires, instant gratification. Those things tend to give us pleasure. We like to eat, have sex, drink, so on and so forth. And that is the basis of pleasure. And so if we're going to make a moral theory based on that, then people are going to live like animals. They're gonna, they're gonna skip work. They're gonna lay out in the sun. They're gonna drink. They're gonna just gorge themselves. They're gonna have sex all the time. They're not going to do the hard things that require dedication and hard work and sacrifice. So that's the objection. But Mill says, no, the problem is you don't understand true human happiness, what human happiness is all about. Because you assume that the life of the beast, the life of an animal, the life of this immediate gratification would produce real pleasure. And what it produces is temporary pleasures, and they can be fun and they can be enjoyable. But what it doesn't produce is a deeper, long-term, more satisfying, more fulfilling life. And that is ultimately what human beings are capable of, and that is what gives us true satisfaction, and that's what's ultimately going to motivate people. Think about the difference in terms of happiness you get from, hanging out at a bar with friends versus, and that could be fun, that could be enjoyable, versus the happiness and the fulfillment and satisfaction you would experience when you walk across the stage at graduation. Or think about, having accomplished, something great as a team after a season of dedication and sacrifice. That is different than, these kind of temporary, skipping practice and just laying out and that kind of thing. So what Mill is saying is that we recognize as human beings that there are these higher pleasures, there are these more satisfying things, so we're going to go for that. We're not going to simply do what is immediately satisfying. Okay, so that's one discussion post. Another discussion post was a vegetarian discussion post, where you watch this video where animals are mistreated, and Steve-O, the person from Jackass, essentially says, become a vegetarian. A number of you said, yeah, absolutely, I should become a vegetarian because the pleasure I get from eating meat is not worth the pain that these animals go through, that they're suffering not simply in the moment, but for their entire lives. And that pain that they experience, the agony that they feel, is more. There's a greater amount of that pain than the pleasure that you get from eating meat. So a number of people went that route. A number of people, also kind of implicitly highlighted the workers. The workers that have to torture and kill and be cruel to animals, they also suffer emotionally and mentally. Other people said, no, I'm not going to stop eating meat. It's true that animals are mistreated, but you could say, look, animals experience different forms of pleasure and pain, and so the pain that they're going through is not of the same level. They're not suffering emotionally, you might say. So it's less pain than they would otherwise experience. Other people pointed out, well, yes, I'll continue eating meat if the system could be different. The idea here would be that if we killed animals more humanely, if we didn't factory farm them, then that would be a reason to eat meat, because the pain that they would undergo, it would be much less. It would be significantly reduced. And with regard to this factory farming, where you pack these thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of animals into tiny cages, there's no veterinary care, and they're produced in ways that are unnatural. A number of you said, I was disgusted, I felt bad. So it's not simply that you're worried about the animals, it's that you felt bad. And there is this famous saying in vegetarian circles that, look, if you put glass walls around the factories, far fewer people would eat meat. In other words, if they saw how the meat was produced, then far fewer would actually, still eat it because they would see the cruelty involved. When we came to eating meat, some people said, yes, what happens to the animals is bad, but let's look at the bigger picture. If everybody became vegetarian, you'd have big job losses. You would have, people that did not have work anymore, and that's bad, and that's a big form of suffering. And, we have to take that into account too. And I think the objection to that is also worth considering. The objection says, well, something like, people might lose jobs in this sector, but there would be other jobs produced. I mean, people are still going to eat. They would just eat differently. And so instead of eating factory farmed meat, people would get jobs in organic food stores or, non-meat producing factories, that kind of thing. So that's the back and forth that went around. And certainly one of the most important points about the video and about utilitarianism is that it does ask us to consider groups or people or even animals that we may not have considered morally relevant before. Because pleasure and pain is the basis of the moral theory, and animals can clearly suffer, we have to take them into consideration. We have to take them into account. The other thing, too, you might consider future generations. The utilitarian would have to consider the pleasure and pain that is going to be associated with future generations based on our actions now. They count. They matter because they're being affected by what we do today. The last utilitarian case study would be Derek Boogaard. He's the hockey player. He was an enforcer. He went out and he pummeled people, and he was really a big fighter, a fearsome person. Some people have said, no, you're not a good utilitarian because, essentially, you hurt people. You punch their face in, you get injuries, so on and so forth. And I think it's absolutely clearly true that he caused pain. And, physical pain, there's no doubt about that. And that absolutely has to be taken into consideration. But if you're going to say he's a bad utilitarian because of that, you've got to consider everything else, all the other things that were produced by his fighting. So it may be the case that he was bad because the pain that he inflicted on others outweighs the pleasure that could have maybe been produced by himself. But we would have to consider other people as well and all the other effects of his actions. The next point would be he personally underwent pain. Yes, he suffered, and eventually he died. And not only did he die and he lost that ability for future happiness, he also, his close friends and families, they suffered as well. They had to endure this deep, deep loss of a friend, of a son, of a brother. And that deep pain, certainly matters and certainly counts. And certainly is part of the consideration. So, with that being the case, it raises us to think, and it leads us to think that, look, yes, millions of fans got pleasure, they got a high, they cheered, they got excited, but is that kind of happiness? It's not the same form as the loss of a son. Is it outweighed by this deep pain that the family is going through? The last point, so some people said, no, he is a good utilitarian. And you oftentimes pointed to his teammates. You said, look, he protected his teammates. So it's not that he's necessarily making them happy, but he is helping them avoid pain by protecting them. And the idea that he's willing to sacrifice to protect them, is certainly important. The idea that he provided excitement to millions of fans. They cheered his name. They had the scene where they're raising the roof, and, it's just an incredible amount of excitement. Certainly counts. Certainly matters. And that's part of it. He did produce a lot of happiness for other people. And it may be the case that even though he suffered, you look at his teammates, you look at his fans, you look at what he did for the sport of hockey. And when you consider all those people, there's a whole lot of people there that got pleasure from him. And so even though he suffered and eventually died, you could say he's a good utilitarian. And I want to come back to Derek Bugard for a second. If he did not consider himself, if he just said simply, I'm going to do this for others, I'm going to do it for my teammates, I'm going to do it for my fans, then even though he may have been producing good consequences, he wouldn't be a true utilitarian because he wouldn't have considered himself. And a utilitarian always has to consider himself or herself. But let's also remember, too, that Derek Bugard did experience some happiness. It wasn't all pain. It wasn't all suffering. He wanted to get into the NHL, and he was thrilled. He was excited. He was completely stoked by getting into the NHL. And that was huge for him. And, he loved it. He loved the cheering. He loved the fans. And so even though he may have suffered physically, there's also an element of emotional satisfaction and joy that comes with his decisions. And so with that being the case, it's not as clear that he is simply sacrificing himself for the whole. There might be something in it for him as well. All right. That's the summary, the recap. Again, I apologize about the lateness of these videos this week, but hope you have a great spring break.